They said the valley was already a coffin. The ridges were sealed with fire, the men below running out of time. And when a female major gave her orders, the general laughed. But she didn't wait for his approval. She climbed into the cockpit, and in a single pass, she would take back the sky. You're watching The Storyscape, where impossible orders collide with unforgettable courage. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The mountains did not forgive. They stood like jagged teeth, rising sharp against a gray sky, their shadows slicing the valley into strips of darkness. Down below, the riverbed twisted like a scar, swollen with spring floods that carried whole trees in their current. To step inside that valley was to step into a trap, a coffin carved from stone, waiting for the lid to close. The SEAL team knew it. They had been moving all night, slipping through shale and thorn, praying that daylight would not find them exposed. But when the sun finally clawed over the ridges, it revealed everything they had feared. The only bridge across the torrent had already been reduced to twisted metal. The ground trembled under the weight of explosions, and from the cliffs above, heavy machine guns dug into the rock, sprayed in overlapping arcs, so that every inch of dirt was already covered before a man could even lift his head. Bullets stitched the mud, mortars burst against the banks. A sniper's round shattered the bark of a tree no thicker than a man's wrist. The team pressed themselves lower, helmets scraping the muck, shoulders grinding against the soil, as if they could burrow deeper and vanish. Their canteens were dry, their magazines light. Radio calls that had once been crisp were now only desperate fragments, half sentences drowned out by static and the crack of incoming fire. At the command post miles away, the scene was no less grim. Maps sprawled across folding tables, red circles scrawled over the ridges like bloodstains. Radios hissed with broken pleas, pinned down, multiple wounded, no way forward. Staff officers scribbled reports they already knew would be signed as losses. The air smelled of coffee gone cold, of sweat, of resignation. Then the words came flat and merciless. A general leaned forward, medals flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights, and declared,
But not every voice agreed. At the far end of the tent stood a woman in a flight suit, her rank stitched across her shoulder, Major. Her gaze was steady, her lips pressed thin, her hands resting against the edge of the map table. Where others saw only a tomb, she saw a seam in the rock, a gap wide enough for the wings of a warthog if flown by someone reckless or relentless enough. Her voice cut through the gloom, calm, precise, certain. We can push an A-10 through that valley, suppress the bunkers, clear the ridge. They still have a chance. The general turned, his eyes narrowed, then softened into something colder, a smile that wasn't a smile at all. A laugh sharp and dismissive broke the tension in the room. "Any jet will do," he said, waving her words aside like smoke. "But this isn't courage, Major. It's suicide. Stand down." The sound of that laughter lingered, louder than the distant gunfire. It carried insult, disbelief, a judgment meant to clip her wings before she ever left the ground. Around the table, a few officers lowered their eyes, unwilling to side with her, unwilling to risk challenging the weight of a general's word. But she didn't lower hers. She knew the valley. She knew the warthog. And more than that, she knew the men bleeding in the mud were not yet ghosts, not if someone refused to let them be. Orders said it was finished. Protocol said to stand down. But she had already flown through storms that tore wings apart, already faced skies lit with missile trails, already lived through the moments others had called impossible. The general's laughter rolled on, but for her, it was already behind her. Because even as the room sank into silence, she had turned her mind elsewhere, to the flight line waiting beyond the tent, to the armored shape of the jet that was more than just metal and rivets. It was her answer, her defiance, her weapon against the word impossible. They had declared the mission lost, but what they didn't know, what none of them could imagine, was that she was already moving to prove them wrong. While the general laughed, she was walking toward her A-10. The riverbed kept chewing at the bank like an animal that wouldn't let go. Every minute the enemy on the ridges adjusted, walked the mortars in, tightened the arcs, closed the trap. A corpsman taped gauze to a shoulder he couldn't properly see, hands shaking not from fear but from dehydration. The team leader counted magazines. 3 men had one each, 2 had none. Across the channel, a culvert mouth blinked with muzzle flash, short, disciplined bursts that said professionals owned that slope. Any air? The radio man asked without looking up. Nothing, the team leader said. Command says airspace is cold. Terrain risk. We hold.
Hold meant bleed. Hold meant wait for a decision made by someone who couldn't smell the cordite or the rot in the river. A new burst of fire tore gravel up like a shrapnel fountain. The men flinched. Then they looked at the sky, as if a noise might save them. It hadn't arrived yet. At the airfield, the world was another element entirely. Heat ripples over concrete, the taste of JP-8 in the throat, the slow metallic tick of cooling metal. The Warthog squatted under a light haze of dust, shark-mouthed and patient, as if it had been carved to sit on battlefields and wait for vows to be tested. The major put a gloved hand on the fuselage and felt the faint echo of its last flight beneath the skin. It felt like a heartbeat. "Ma'am," the crew chief said, stepping in with a headset crooked around his neck. "Ops just called. Stand down order. Confirmed, straight from the top." She looked past him to the gun fairing that bulged like a promise. "Spin the inertial," she said calmly. "Fuel at 6.5. I want full HEI mix and everything hot on Station 3. Mavericks good?" "They're good." He glanced toward the ops shack, then back to her. "Look, you didn't hear it from me, but if you're going, don't go alone up there. The valley's a meat grinder. No turn radius." "I won't be turning," she said. He swallowed, nodded. Then he jogged to the ground cart and brought the world to life. Gyros started their slow, majestic whine. The APU coughed and then settled into a steady growl that harmonized with the airfield's hum. She climbed the ladder and slid into the seat. The cockpit wrapped around her like something that knew her name. Switchology flowed without thought. Battery, inverter, APU gen, boost pumps, engine 1, engine 2. The needles rose, the fans were a blur. The jet wasn't just waking up, it was remembering. "Hog 2-1, the tower crackled. "Negative start, negative taxi. You are not cleared." She keyed the mic. "Tower, Hog 2-1, copy traffic. Request immediate northbound departure, Ridge Corridor." A pause. Paper shuffling she could practically hear. Then another voice came on, older, heavier, lacquered with authority. "Major, this is command. Power down. That is an order." She glanced at the fuel totalizer, then at the map strip taped to her kneeboard. Crosswinds 12 at the surface, gusting 18. High density altitude. The takeoff roll would stretch. The valley narrowed.
The jet rolled heavy and certain past hangar doors that had watched every victory and mistake of the last decade. Crew pushed chocks, trotted alongside, gave her the ritual thumbs up that meant more than clearance ever would. One of the younger airmen, barely old enough to shave, freckles bright in the sun, held up a board hastily scrawled with grease pencil, "Bring them home." She dipped the nose and flashed the landing light twice. "Hog 2-1, the tower came back, tighter now. "Last warning, do not enter the active. General's directive."
She lined up on centerline, checked the windsock, checked her gut. Brakes held, throttles came forward, the A-10 hunched like an animal at the gate. The first sound was a hiss, then a roar as the engines built through the lag and into the kind of thrust that vibrated bone. She felt it in her chest more than in her hands. "Tower," she said. "I'm rolling." "Major." The rest dissolved in the thunder. She released the brakes and the jet leapt, heavy wheels chattering over seams in the concrete. Airspeed alive, 20 knots, 40, 60. She tracked the center line with little taps of rudder, eyes already past the end of the runway, already in the notch in the hills where she would need to be a spear, not a plane. 80 knots, 100. The nose felt light. She pulled a breath in and let it out. She wasn't listening to the tower anymore. She was listening to the valley. Rotation. The nose wheel lifted, the sudden hush of tire friction replaced by the clean, impossible quiet of flight. Gear up, flaps to auto. She kept it low, ground effect her ally, then punched right into a climbing turn that stayed just beneath the radar shelves she knew would trigger more voices trying to pull her down. The crew chief somewhere at the edge of the runway raised a fist to the sky. Far north, the ridgeline cut the horizon like a black blade. On the ground, the SEAL team leader pressed his radio to his ear, willing static to become something else. Twice he thought he heard a tone that wasn't gunfire. The corpsman tapped his shoulder, pointed at the slope. A squad-sized element was beginning to move down and bounding overwatch, methodical, patient, the kind of movement that said they had time and the team did not. 2 minutes, he said. We'll smoke and shift east on my mark. Save your last rounds for the rush. He meant it to sound steady. It only sounded tired. A shadow slid across the river like a wing. "Sir," the radio man whispered, voice suddenly small. Do you hear that?" At first it was only a flutter in the air, an argument between wind and rock. Then it thickened into metal. Not a high pitch, a growl that belonged to things designed to end arguments. Heads tilted up along the ridge, along the river, in rooms with maps and on rocks with rifles. The sound did not ask permission, it announced a decision. "She's coming," the corpsman said, and didn't realize he'd said it aloud. They had counted the team out. They hadn't counted on a major who flew valleys like they were runways. The mountains rose. She met them on purpose. Terrain following wasn't a switch in this jet. It was a pact between eyes and gut. She skimmed across a saddle where wind tried to lift her wing and fail. The cabin pressure warning blinked, meaningless at this altitude, and she clicked it away with a gloved thumb. Master arm stayed safe. Not yet. Not until she could see the geometry with her own eyes. She called on guard. "Any JTAC on the valley floor. This is Hog 2-1. Mark your position." Silence. Then a voice, raw and tinny. "Hog, this is Victor 1. Green smoke if we had any. We're dry. We are at the dead tree, center channel. If you can't see it, just aim for the stupidest place to die." A smile, small, humorless, touched her mouth. "Copy the stupidest place," she said. "Eyes on the culvert out across. How many guns?" "Too many." "That's a number," she said. "Stand by." She thumbed the switch that changed the jet from airplane to verdict. Master arm, on. The HUD washed into a different kind of truth. Range tickers, Piper logic. She barely felt the weight of the gun. She felt its intention. The notch opened ahead, a dark seam cut into rock, just wide enough for a set of wings and a decision. She dropped the nose into the seam, and the ridges rose to swallow her whole. The seam was barely wider than her wingspan. Rock jutted like knives on either side, shadows flashing across the canopy in strobing bursts. Any hesitation, any overcorrection, and the valley would grind her into wreckage. But her hands were steady, light on the stick, trimming in whispers rather than commands.
She flew as if the mountain itself had written the path, and she was only tracing its lines. Below, the SEAL team could see the silhouette overhead, low, fast, unmistakable. The radio man forgot the weight of the handset and let it dangle against his chest. Every man stared upward. In the air's vibration, in the unmistakable growl, they recognized a name that meant salvation to those who had learned what the Warthog could do. On the ridges, enemy gunners pivoted. Spotters screamed in another language, waving their arms, pointing barrels skyward. Tracers leapt, green and furious, sowing the air in cross-hatched curtains. For a second, it looked impossible. No opening, no escape. And still she came.
The command post erupted in chaos. The general lurched toward the console, headset clamped tight over his ears. Who cleared that launch? Shut her down. She'll be dead in 30 seconds. A junior officer, pale and wide-eyed, stammered, "Sir, she's already in the canyon." The general slammed his palm against the table, rattling coffee cups and map pins. "Pull her back! Do you understand? This is insubordination. This is—" But another voice cut in, quieter, yet firmer. A colonel leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he listened to the tone filtering through the radio net. "She's not pulling back, sir." The tent fell silent for a beat, the weight of that truth heavier than orders. Inside the cockpit, the major breathed slow, lungs filling on rhythm, not panic. Her eyes locked to the culvert mouth ahead, that black slit where muzzle flashes winked like fireflies with teeth. The targeting symbology danced, the pipper drifting across stone, never quite catching. She held the jet low, almost skimming the river, turbulence rocking her shoulders. A sudden impact rattled the fuselage, tracer fire stitching across her right wing. Warning lights flickered. Hydraulic pressure dipped, then held. She rode it out, jaw clenched, heart unmoved. "Victor 1, she called on the net, voice steady. "Mark your heads down. Run in hot, 10 seconds. The SEAL team leader jammed his men deeper into the mud, arms over helmets. "Down. Now. Whatever you do, don't look." The corpsman grabbed the youngest by the collar, forcing his face into the dirt. The river stank of iron and sweat and fear. At the cliffside, the enemy braced, their guns tracked, their confidence unbroken. They had owned this valley since the war began. They had watched every approach die and fire. They had no reason to believe this one would end differently. Until the growl became a scream. The major rolled level, thumb pressed hard against the trigger. The jet shuddered. The world itself seemed to rip open, and the GAAU-8 Avenger spoke with its ancient, brutal tongue. A sound not of gunfire, but of judgment tore through the valley. Rocks split, bunkers dissolved in dust clouds, steel was peeled back like tin. The gun chewed the ridgeline, a line of fire carving through positions that had been declared untouchable. For the men below, it was not just sound, it was vibration in their bones, a shock wave that told them death had changed its target. In the command tent, voices faltered. No one moved, no one sipped, no one scribbled another loss report. The general's mouth hung open as the headset filled with a thunder he could not talk over. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The echoes chased each other into the distance. Dust rolled over the river.
He swallowed, then whispered words his men would never forget. She just rewrote the map. They had called the valley a coffin, but coffins didn't roar back. In the cockpit, the major banked hard, pulling the jet through an arc so tight her vision tunneled, edges darkening. She bit through it, rode the G's, leveled just above the ridge. Her hands never shook. She checked her panels, hydraulics bleeding but still alive, engines hot but steady. One pass was never enough. She would have to go again. As she turned back into the canyon, the surviving guns on the far ridge locked onto her, and every trigger on the mountain was waiting. The mountains awoke in fury. Where silence had hung for a heartbeat, now every ridgeline came alive with fire. Heavy guns barked from stone mouths, tracer arcs crisscrossing the canyon in webs of green. Mortars began to thump again, their shells walking toward the riverbed like a giant pounding nails into a coffin lid. The air thickened with smoke and dust, torn earth drifting in choking clouds. The SEAL team pressed flat against the mud, ears ringing, hearts pounding. They had seen what the first pass had done, what no commander believed possible. But they also knew the enemy wasn't finished. The far slope still spat fire, snipers still prowled, the valley was not yet open. "Stay down," the team leader barked, voice raw. "She's not done." In the cockpit, alarms flared. Hydraulic caution, engine temp warning. She clicked them silent with practiced flicks, eyes never leaving the ridge. Her right wing carried a new scar where tracer fire had gnawed through paint and metal. Control felt heavier, sluggish at the edges, but the jet was alive, and as long as it breathed, so did she. She scanned the far slope. Multiple muzzle flashes blinked in disciplined rhythm, their arcs designed to overlap and leave her no seam. They thought she would break off. They thought the first strike had been her limit. They were wrong. "Hog 2-1, re-engaging," she said calmly into the net. "Targeting North Ridge. Stand by." At the command tent, the general's face had drained of color. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, voice trembling between rage and disbelief. "She's turning back? That's impossible. She won't make it. No one makes a second run." No one answered him. Around the room, officers stared at the live feed of telemetry, at the small blip looping back into the jaws of the canyon. They had declared the mission lost. Now the mission was rewriting itself in real time, and they no longer had the words to stop it. The A-10 banked, nose dropping into the canyon again. She eased the throttle forward, engines bellowing, the growl deepening into a roar that shook dust from the cliffs. She squeezed the trigger. The jet shuddered under the weight of its fury. The Avenger thundered, shells ripping into bunkers that had stood for years. Earth erupted, steel collapsed, fire bloomed where once there had only been confidence. Enemy crews scattered, men abandoning positions they sworn could never fall. From the riverbed, the SEALs saw the ridge shatter in a cascade of smoke and flame. The air tasted of cordite and stone dust. They lifted their heads just long enough to watch the impossible being erased before their eyes. "She's cutting us a way out," the corpsman whispered, awe overtaking fear. But the fight was not one-sided. A flash from the ridge, different, sharper, the hiss of something not meant for rifles. A missile streaked skyward, white smoke tail cutting across the canyon like chalk on a blackboard. The major saw it immediately. Instinct snapped her hand to the countermeasures switch. Flares spat from the wingtips, burning bright, tumbling into the air like stars. The missile lunged toward the heat, veered, then detonated harmlessly against the mountainside. Shrapnel rattled against her fuselage. The jet rocked, alarms blinking, but she stayed level, heart steady. She keyed the mic, voice calm as if reciting procedure. Missile defeated, continuing run. In the command post, silence reigned. A younger officer muttered, almost reverently, "She's not flying, she's carving." The major pulled up, skimming the ridgeline by meters, the ground rushing past in a blur. Her instruments screamed warnings, but her focus was on the valley opening below, on the path she had carved in fire and steel.
The SEAL team leader pressed his radio, voice breaking but alive. "Victor 1 to Hog, your corridor is clear. We're moving." For the first time in hours, the men rose, shifting east, weapons ready, boots pounding through the mud. The river no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a crossing. They had called her reckless, but reckless didn't clear a valley. Reckless didn't silence an army. As she leveled out, the major caught her breath. 2 passes made, the valley bleeding smoke, the men below moving again. And yet her gut told her the fight wasn't finished. Somewhere in the haze, a weapon still waited, patient and unseen. Her jet groaned, hydraulics struggling, warning lights glowing like embers in the dark. But she pushed the throttle forward anyway, because if there was one thing the mountains had taught her, it was that silence came only when someone forced it. And as she turned for a third pass, a second missile lock screamed in her headset, this time from a launcher hidden deep in the rocks. The warning tone wasn't just a sound, it was a scream, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the cockpit, relentless, demanding her attention. Missile lock. The HUD flashed, the RWR display bloomed with a symbol that meant one thing: something bigger than a rifle, smarter than a mortar, and far deadlier than the men with guns on the ridges.
Her thumb snapped the countermeasure switch. Flares spat from her jet in quick succession, burning hot and tumbling behind like fiery bait. She rolled hard left, the valley wall clawing close enough to scrape the sky, then snapped back right, the airframe groaning in protest. The missile didn't bite. It kept coming. On the ground, the SEALs saw it before she did, the sharp spear of smoke arcing across the canyon, chasing her tail. One of the younger men actually shouted into the dirt as if words could change the trajectory. "No! No! No!" The team leader gritted his teeth. He'd seen it before, how a single hit could turn a bird into a coffin. He braced for the inevitable. But inevitable wasn't in her vocabulary. She pulled harder, dragging the jet into a climb that scraped the edges of physics. The missile streaked closer, its seeker locked, its hiss filling the canyon like a predator snarl. At the last second, she punched chaff, thin aluminum shards that burst into a glittering cloud, confusing the seeker's eye. The missile darted into the decoy, detonating in a burst of fire that rattled the valley floor. Shrapnel lashed her fuselage. Warning lights bloomed like red blossoms across the panel. Right hydraulic pressure dipped again, the jet sluggish in response. She flexed the stick, coaxing it, reminding it they weren't finished. The hog moaned, but it obeyed. She exhaled once, calm, cold, focused. "Hog 2-1, she transmitted, voice even. "Still alive." In the command tent, no one spoke. The general's earlier laugh had long since vanished, swallowed by the thunder of her defiance. He stood rigid, jaw clenched, but even he couldn't mask what flickered across his face: fear, awe, something between the two. A young captain at the back whispered to no one in particular, "She's rewriting the doctrine." On the ridge, enemy crews scrambled. The first passes had shattered their positions, but survivors rushed to man the hidden guns. RPG teams set up hasty shots, desperate to swat her from the sky. A second launcher was dragged into position, its crew frantic, shouting at each other as they tried to reload. They thought if they could just get one more shot, the coffin would close again. But she wasn't giving them that chance. She dropped back into the canyon, low and brutal, the nose aligning with the rearmost bunkers that still spat fire. The GAU-8 was hungry. Her thumb found the trigger, and once more the valley trembled. Brrrr. The sound was not just noise, it was annihilation. Stone fractured, bunkers disintegrated, fire erupted in waves. Enemy positions vanished beneath the rain of tungsten. The river itself seemed to recoil, water splashing upward in response to the... Her cockpit was a storm of warnings. Heat build, hydraulic fluid low, master caution glaring like an accusation. The jet bled, but it was still hers, and she refused to let go. She pulled up, skimming so low her wingtip nearly brushed the ridge. Dust and rock whipped against the fuselage. She had seconds to decide. Egress east to safety, or turn for one final run to erase the last threat still hiding in the rocks. Her breath slowed. Her hands were steady. In her gut, there was no choice at all. In the command post, the general's voice cracked as he tried to reassert control. She has to disengage. That aircraft can't survive another run. Get her out of there. But nobody moved to relay the order. They were all listening to something else. The rhythm of defiance carried over the net. The proof that impossible was a word losing its meaning. She's not asking anymore, the colonel said quietly. She's declaring. The SEAL team leader pressed his radio, voice hoarse but fierce. Hog, whatever you've got left, bring it. We'll move when you do. She heard him, she believed him, and she decided. They thought she'd stop after one pass. They thought 2 was her limit. But the truth was simpler. She hadn't even begun to finish the fight. She banked again, the valley opening like a throat ready to swallow. Her panels screamed in protest, the jet wounded, trembling, but still hers to command. Ahead, the last launcher flashed into life, smoke curling as its crew locked her in their sights. Her thumb hovered over the trigger, eyes fixed, jaw set. When the missile ignited and streaked toward her, she pressed forward, refusing to turn away, choosing instead to dive straight into the fire. The third missile streaked like a viper, smoke tail curling across the canyon. Every man on the ridge shouted, certain the sky would finally take her down. In the command tent, the general leaned forward, whispering words meant only for himself. No one survives 3. But she was already committed. Nose down, throttles forward, the A-10 dove straight into the fire. Flares spat from the wings, burning like fragments of the sun, scattering into the gorge. The missile lunged, confused, then clipped one of the flares. It detonated early, the blast rocking her jet, rattling her bones, peppering her fuselage with shrapnel. Warnings lit the panel like a Christmas tree, hydraulic pressure bleeding.
On the riverbed, the SEALs didn't wait. They rose as one, sprinting through smoke and mud, rifles raised, boots pounding toward the shattered corridor. For the first time in hours, they were moving forward, not hiding. The corpsman slapped a wounded man's shoulder and barked, "You're walking out of here. No more graves today." Above them, the major pulled up hard, the Warthog screaming, wings scarred, fuselage bleeding. Her jet wobbled, one engine coughing, but it climbed. She glanced once at her panels, once at the ridgeline, and once at the open sky. The job was done. The valley was theirs again. In the command tent, no one spoke. The general's laugh, the one that had dismissed her, mocked her, was gone. In its place was silence, heavy and undeniable. Finally, the colonel broke it with a whisper. She took back the sky. The words hung, not as praise, but as truth. The SEALs reached the far bank, dragging each other across, eyes still locked upward. The corpsman, mud-streaked and grinning despite blood on his hands, muttered, "She erased impossible." And in that moment, the myth began. Not in medals, not in reports, but in whispers among men who had seen a Coffin Valley torn open by a single pilot who refused to stand down. The mountains would remember her thunder. The sky would carry her defiance, and every soldier who lived that day would carry a single truth. It wasn't command that saved them. It was a woman who refused to laugh with the general. One pass could change a map, but 3 passes from her A-10 changed the war.